带一路承载着我们对共同发展的追求，将帮助各国打破发展瓶颈，缩小发展差距，共享发展成果，打造甘苦与共、命运相连的发展共同体。为“一带一路”建设美好的未来，为各国发展繁荣，为这次高峰论坛圆满成功，为各位嘉宾和家人的健康干杯！
That is what Chinese President Xi Jinping had to say at the first ever Silk Road Summit held in May 2017 in Beijing. Xi hosted leaders from 29 nations for showcasing his cherished One Belt, One Road initiative that he launched in 2013. Later, it was rebranded simply as the Belt and Road Initiative. The modern route under the BRI seeks to connect Asia with Africa and Europe via land and maritime networks. It's inspired by the concept of the Silk Road established during the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago, an ancient network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean via Eurasia for centuries. With this ambitious project, China aims to stabilize its western peripheries and rekindle its economy. China touted it as a project of the century with an estimated cost of over $1 trillion. Experts predicted that China's expenses over the life of the BRI could even touch a staggering $8 trillion. Shocking, isn't it? The project aimed at constructing highways, bridges, hydroelectric dams, and other infrastructure. But of late, Xi's grand plan seems to be losing its footing.
The Belt and Road Initiative is definitely failing, and I don't think it will survive this decade.
7 years since China's BRI is running into several issues in its partner countries. Last year, in Pakistan, protests sparked against the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in the port city of Gwadar, demanding for the Chinese to leave. In Sri Lanka, soaring prices and crippling international debts have been stirring citizen protests since 2019. China offers the Taliban economic support and seeks to revive business ventures inside Afghanistan. But the Taliban's activities affect the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Can China truly rely on the Taliban? And then there is this. The impact of the ongoing Ukraine war has fallen hard on the BRI projects, which has indeed put a stopper in China's expansion plans into Western Europe.
As this war has slowed down economic opportunities around the globe, it's creating some for China with the supply of non-lethal equipment and potentially lethal equipment down the road, but it's also slowing and causing supply chain disruptions in other parts of the globe that make it harder for it to continue its BRI work. So in a way, it's a combination of challenges for China.
Its BRI plans in Africa have also taken a hit with increased US and European spending in the region. According to a recent report from the Green Finance and Development Center in Shanghai, China's investment in the continent related to its global infrastructure development strategy dropped by a whopping 55% to $7.5 billion last year. Last but not least, the trade war between the United States and China and mounting tensions with the West at large have added to its woes. The Chinese economy itself has been battered by the tight pandemic restrictions it had imposed over the last 3 years. At the same time, it is also struggling to recover the debt assistance it had made to other nations. So where is China heading now with its bold BRI plan? Let's explore the not-so-promising route it might be on. Beijing's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative has been called a Chinese Marshall Plan. It is said to be a Chinese campaign for global dominance. From Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe and Africa, BRI includes 71 countries that account for half the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. BRI led the Chinese firms to engage in construction work across the globe on an unparalleled scale. Chinese companies have secured more than $340 billion in construction contracts. Chinese money has gushed into South Asia and especially Pakistan in the past decade. Pakistan enjoys a special economic relationship with China, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPAC, is regarded as the crown jewel of the BRI. It will offer China the shortest access to the markets of Central Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Europe through the deep-sea port of Gwadar, which is the linchpin of the initiative. Although CPAC was launched in 2015, local resistance affected its pace. Pakistan realized that China's investment is primarily about its own economic and geopolitical objectives, as it has commercial and military interests in Gwadar. In 2021, protests erupted in Pakistan's port city Gwadar against a severe shortage of water and electricity, and threats to livelihoods. Demonstrators, including fishers and local workers, blocked the roads. They burned tires, chanted slogans, and shut down the city. The protests were part of a growing discontent with China's presence in Gwadar, in which China invested billions in infrastructure projects. In January 2023, protests continued to escalate. Gwadar rights movement leader issued a warning to Chinese nationals to leave the Gwadar port area, potentially jeopardizing economic ties between China and Pakistan.
The CPAC faces its own challenges. I mean, it's a hugely expensive project, $62 billion alone, but then there's, another potential, huge amounts of investments going in on top of just the corridor itself and the connection, the Gwadar port and the like. And so we see some slowdown in these projects. Well, there's no doubt that Pakistan's instability affects China's ability to operate effectively there, as it would any country, and as it affects the Pakistani people themselves. The Gwadar port obviously is a huge investment for Pakistan and for China, and a key part of that economic corridor that China is seeking to build with Pakistan. And so, the investment there is huge. We've seen, obviously, work stoppages. We've seen challenges. We've seen the concern of the Pakistani government about the debt that's being taken on to do this. And of course, anytime you have political instability of the kind that Pakistan has, protests and the like, that's going to make it harder to engage in these large-scale, long-term economic development projects.
China has shelled out large loans to countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan to secure its BRI dream. It has also considered Afghanistan's membership and participation in the BRI, with a delegation from Afghanistan participating in its forum in 2017. Let's not forget that even before the fall of Kabul, a Taliban delegation headed by its senior leader, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, had visited China and held talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The Taliban had declared that it sees China as a friend of Afghanistan. The Taliban's complete control of Afghanistan and withdrawal of the US troops, China appears to be chalking out plans to extend its BRI to Afghanistan and invest in the country to exploit its rich minerals and rare earth mines. Considering China's engagement with the Taliban, will it be able to reach its BRI goals?
China sees what a lot of nations have seen in Afghanistan, which is a country that needs help, that wants assistance, that needs political stability to empower its people and to take advantage of economic opportunities. You know, Afghanistan sits on one of the richest deposits of critical and rare earth minerals in the world, and has never really been able to develop those resources because of the constant warring between various groups, ethnic and otherwise. The constant flow of corruption in that country. It's anybody's guess as to whether the Taliban can really consolidate power and be successful. Taliban leadership that remains in Pakistan, that does create instability in that border region, creates instability in the northern areas, which sometimes the Pakistani military, asserts itself in and sometimes doesn't. So all of that absolutely will have an impact on both China's efforts to invest in that corridor, that economic corridor, but also any investments it may or may not make in Afghanistan.
On the 1st of April 2022, Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa declared a nationwide public emergency following violent protests over the country's worst economic crisis in decades. The economic disaster is blamed on currency shortages caused by the travel ban imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to Sri Lanka's inability to purchase fuel, resulting in an extreme shortage of food and essential commodities. While Colombo battles the most significant economic crisis, analysts believe China's debt trap diplomacy is behind Sri Lanka's mounting debt woes. China lent billions over the past decade for infrastructure projects like the Hambantota port and a coal power plant in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka later asked China to restructure debt payments of about $3.5 billion. Has China turned a blind eye after deluding the island country in a financial trap?
I think Sri Lanka was a big black eye for the Belt and Road Initiative that will make other states leery about accepting these large loans that they can't repay, and China's not going to be working later on adjusting the terms. I think it was a major embarrassment for the program, and it certainly hurt China's relationships with Sri Lanka. It's making the World Bank upset because China's not being responsible in addressing the dire debt situation of these nations.
On the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded and occupied parts of Ukraine. The war triggered a massive shock to the global economy and trembled stability of China's BRI plans in Russia. China's BRI investments in Russia fell to zero for the first time, indicating Beijing's reluctance to incur sanctions in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war. It was reported Beijing struck no deals with Russian entities under the BRI program in 2022. However, a year earlier, in 2021, Russia and China signed deals worth about $2 billion. And not just Russia. BRI's westward expansion of China looks bleak amid the Russia-Ukraine war. According to China Shengxing International, a domestic credit rating agency, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has heavily impacted the progress of the BRI. China-Europe freight rail services through Ukraine have been disrupted. Chinese projects in Ukraine are valued at $6.64 billion. Their progress has been stalled. The BRI had presented tremendous opportunities in terms of trade and growth for Europe. But with the ongoing war, several projects under the BRI have been thrown into disarray.
I believe that China does not want to see Russia lose the Ukraine war. And China is happy to blame the war on NATO and the United States. But I believe China hates its war. It's been bad for its economic and political relationships. It threatens its trade relationships with Western Europe.
And then in February, on the occasion of the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China proposed a 12-point peace plan to end the war. Many analysts see this move of Beijing as an opportunity in disguise.
There'd probably be a BRI effort in Ukraine right now if there was not a war. And I think that perhaps an objective of this China peace plan is that China would like to rebuild Ukraine and loan it huge amounts of money. That would give China a foothold in this European power.
In the continent of Africa, China has lent hundreds of billions of dollars as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. In Zambia, China commissioned over 3 major infrastructure projects. In Ethiopia, China financed the Aisha wind power project under the BRI scheme. In Ghana, China's most significant investment was the construction of the 400-megawatt Bui Dam in 2013. These projects reflect China's heightened activities in the region, but it came with risks. One of these is the Western interest in the continent. In June 2021, the US and all G7 countries launched the Build Back Better World, better known as B3W, to meet the infrastructure needs of low and middle-income countries, particularly in Africa. B3W aims to invest $40 trillion in developing nations, including Africa, by 2035. These developments may have altered China's plans in recent years. Beijing is no longer funding big projects in African countries. Big-ticket projects under the Belt and Road Initiative have been shelved, according to a report by an international law firm. Chinese bank financing for infrastructure projects in Africa under BRI fell from $11 billion in 2017 to $3.3 billion in 2020. Another report said only $4.5 billion worth of investment was attracted by the sub-Saharan countries in 2022, compared with $8.1 billion in 2021. While no new funding was announced by China last year for connectivity projects, Germany and other countries secured large deals, including an $8.7 billion project in Egypt.
The problem, of course, with Chinese behavior in Africa is, as the African nations have learned, is it's really about resource extraction. It's about going there, getting access to materials, bringing in Chinese labor, not even using African labor, and then taking material out. So yes, they're building roads, they're building parliament buildings and the like, they're building ports, but those roads and those ports are being used to extract resources and take them to China, right? And make these nations dependent on China for the money to build those roads and to pay those debts back, and then dependent on China for that supply and that outflow of goods as well. And so in a lot of ways, I think the African nations are really waking up to the reality of what China is and how China's operating there.
They've invested heavily in countries that have access to critical minerals, since China is trying to corner the market on these minerals. China is extracting some of these minerals from within China, but some of them are not available in China, and they have to be obtained from other nations such as Africa.
The largest commercial conflict in modern history, the China-US trade war, started in 2018. The then-President Donald Trump accused China of unfair trading practices, while China claimed the US was trying to restrict its rise as a global economic power. The trade war caused economic pain on both sides. It also weighed heavily on the global economy due to additional import tariffs levied by both China and the US. The prolonged conflict reached a turning point in January 2020 with the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal. But the damage was done.
I think it's hurt the Chinese economy, and I think it's going to get worse. There's now a new committee in the U.S. House of Representatives that is investigating the threat from China. There's another subcommittee looking at China's responsibility for the COVID virus, and this is going to lead to more impediments on U.S.-China trade. The Biden administration has put a ban on exporting computer chips to China.
The COVID-19 pandemic caused a wave of economic crises in China's Belt and Road Initiative. There has been a dramatic drop in export revenues in China. China's strict zero-COVID policies weighed down its economy and stalled global supply chains. Several BRI countries facing high external debt are also hit hard by the pandemic. According to a report in 2022, under the BRI, China dumped over $1 trillion as loans to nearly 150 developing and least developed countries at high rates of interest, becoming the world's largest official creditor for the first time. Many of the projects have stalled and Beijing's loans have gone sour. Beijing is poised to confront multiple debt crises in countries where it is heavily invested due to BRI.
China has loaned about $105 billion between 2019 and 2021, and much of that debt has been to states that were bad debts and has responded by just loaning more money and refusing to restructuring the debt. But China is facing at least $5 trillion in debt needed by local governments and cities because of problems with investment, problems with property, problems with the banks.
Accusations that Belt and Road is a debt trap designed to take control of local infrastructure have further tainted its reputation. Instead of offering aid grants, China offers huge loans at commercial interest rates that countries have to pay within a fixed number of years. Loans are far more secretive. The country does not disclose data on loans. When it was first announced in 2013, the ambitious BRI was widely seen as something that would propel China's ascent to global power, but clearly, along the way, the initiative has lost momentum.